Welcome to School Food 101. I'm Cheryl Belinsky, joined here by my colleague Becky O'Connor. We're going to provide you a fairly high-level overview of school food, what it is, what influences it, and the rules and regulations that govern it. While the content may be a bit dry, in order to implement farm-to-school programs that focus at all on procurement, we have to understand the context that our school food partners operate within. Following this session, participants will be able to identify the child nutrition programs administered in New York State, describe the federal and state rules and regulations governing school food, understand the various revenue streams that fund child nutrition programs, understand factors that influence child nutrition programs, and lastly, identify strategies for incorporating local food into child nutrition programs. There's a fairly wide array of child nutrition programs, all of which can drive demand for local products with their large volume purchasing and provide a steady market opportunity for local producers. Important to note that some child nutrition programs extend beyond the traditional K-12 school. The National School Lunch Program provides lunch for students at K-12 schools, including public and nonprofit private schools and residential child care institutions. There's a wide variety of sizes of programs and ways of purchasing for the National School Lunch Program. In a small community, these child nutrition programs may serve only a few hundred students, where in a large community, this child nutrition program may feed tens of thousands of students each day. Next, there is the Fresh Fruit and Vegetable Program. This provides additional fresh fruits and vegetable snacks throughout the school day in eligible elementary schools. Lastly, the School Breakfast Program, which, as it sounds, provides breakfast to students and often operates in conjunction with the National School Lunch Program. Child and Adult Care Food Program, or CACFP, is another child nutrition program. It provides meals and snacks for children in early care and education, which includes preschools, child care centers, family child care homes, and after-school programs. The CACFP program also serves adult daycare. However, since our focus is on child nutrition programs, we will not dig into that. The Summer Food Service Program, or the Seamless Summer option, ensures that children have access to healthy meals over summer breaks when school is not in session. Many SFSP and SSO programs take place at a school or in a community location like a park, library, or even farmers market. For the purposes of this training, we will be focusing on programs most often administered through school districts, including the National School Lunch Program and the School Breakfast Program. Child nutrition programs reach a significant number of children in our state, and a lot of money is spent on food to service these programs. This represents a significant market opportunity for our producers across the state. Further, child nutrition programs tend to be a very stable market, barring the last few years, making them even more attractive to select producers. The number of children served in the National School Lunch Program is roughly 1.2 million a day, and breakfast is a little over 650,000. The amount of federal reimbursement that comes in annually through these programs for the National School Lunch Program is about $563 million and $213 million for the National School Breakfast Program. We're going to talk a bit more about federal reimbursement in a few slides. Lastly, there are 511 reported school food authorities participating in Farm to School, and this is per the USDA Farm to School census. That represents 77.3% of the SFAs that responded to the census. Both federal and state governments play important roles in the administration of child nutrition programs. So let's look at how these key players are connected. Funding for school meal programs, like those we just talked about, comes through the federal government, specifically the USDA Food and Nutrition Service. USDA FNS determines meal patterns and nutrition requirements and meal reimbursement rates, which will be discussed later in this section. Federal funds are paid to state agencies who are responsible for the administration and oversight of the child nutrition programs. The state agency that provides program support in New York State is the New York State Department of Education. The School Food Authority is the administrating unit for the operation of school meal programs. SFAs submit an application to the state administering agency, again in New York, it's the New York State Department of Education, to get approval to run a USDA child nutrition program in their community. SFAs receive federal reimbursements for meals served and are responsible for running the child nutrition program, including purchasing and ensuring that number of meals served are being counted correctly and eligibility criteria are being met. The formal definition of a school food authority is the governing body which is responsible for the administration of one or more schools and has the legal authority to operate child nutrition programs therein or be otherwise approved by USDA to operate the program. School Food Authority and school district are often used interchangeably, but it's important to recognize, specifically in New York, that they're not always one and the same. Here are some scenarios that illustrate the way school food is managed in New York. In the first scenario, we have a school food authority responsible for a single district. That is the most straightforward in a case where those terms mentioned previously are, for all intents and purposes, interchangeable. The second scenario is when a single SFA is responsible for multiple districts. The third introduces BOCES, or Boards of Cooperative Educational Services. In some cases, BOCES is the SFA, responsible for multiple SFAs, or as they're called, component schools. In other cases, BOCES acts like a contract food service management company on behalf of a group of component school food authorities. Lastly, the School Food Authority can contract food service operations out. In New York, something like 18% of school food authorities are managed by a third-party company. As previously mentioned, that third-party company may be a BOCES or a company like Aramark, Sodexo's, Chartwell, Personal Touch, or Whitson's. There are 37 BOCES across New York that offer a varying menu of services to nearly all districts across the state, sans New York's Big Five public school districts, New York City, Buffalo, Syracuse, Rochester, and Yonkers. Depending on the COSER arrangement or cooperative service agreement that a district has with their partner BOCES, services will vary, but they can include bidding, staffing, and management of operations. Districts can contract for all of these services, assuming their BOCES provides them, or none of them. Further, districts can and do work with multiple BOCES in their region for varying services. As you can imagine, detangling the web of who does what within school food can be a bit confusing, and as it currently stands, there is no one-stop shop at this time that breaks it all down. Thankfully, the farm-to-school coordinators rooted in regions across the state have a solid working knowledge of how food is flowing to their school food markets, so they're a great point of contact to connect with should you have any questions. Now that we know a little bit about the diversity of school meal programs and how school food is managed, we're going to break down how school food is funded, because that too isn't a terribly simple answer. Casually called school food funds, these funds are actual dollars coming into the School Food Authority through various revenue streams, including federal and state reimbursement, paid participation, a la carte sales, catering sales, grants, and other sources of revenue as well. The School Food Authority has discretionary spending as to how to spend these funds. Becky is going to walk you through school food procurement a bit later. It's these funds that pay for the contracts awarded through those procurement processes. An important fun fact that is often overlooked is that school food authorities run their own separate nonprofit budget, separate of the district's general fund. Next, we're going to talk about entitlement. Entitlement is a sum of money awarded to school food authorities by the federal government, which has to be spent in a very prescribed way, which we'll talk about in just a moment. The amount of entitlement received is based on a school food authority's average daily participation rate. In other words, how many reimbursable meals they're serving on average per day. There are 4 prescribed ways an SFA can spend their entitlement money. The first is on USDA foods, which includes 200 plus items the federal government buys in bulk and makes available to school food authorities. Included are items from every commodity group. New York Office of General Services sends out a food preference survey to whittle down the 200 plus items to approximately 30 items, which vary slightly by region. New York SFAs buy off the abridged list using their entitlement dollars. The second way school food authorities spend their entitlement is on USDA food processing, more frequently referred to as diversion. In this case, school food authorities use entitlement funds to purchase USDA food items intended for further processing. The USDA foods are diverted to a select processor and then shipped to the school. An example of this is the school food authority using entitlement funds to purchase whole chickens and diverting them to a processor to turn them into chicken strips. The school food authority pays for the USDA whole chicken using their entitlement funds, and the cost associated with processing is paid for by their school food dollars. The third way school food authorities spend entitlement is through the USDA Department of Defense Fresh Fruit and Vegetable Program, which allows them to purchase minimally processed, domestically grown produce through pre-approved vendors. Currently, there are 2 DoD-approved vendors, Boulevard in the western part of the state and Gargiulo in the eastern part of the state. The fourth way school food authorities can spend their entitlement funds is through the pilot project for unprocessed fruits and vegetables, which is similar to the DoD program in that the funds are directed towards domestic fruits and vegetables. However, there are significantly more vendors approved to participate in this program, 23 at the latest count. All told, USDA foods account for 12 to 15% of the lunch tray on any given day, and as such serve as a critical piece in the school food puzzle. Now that we know a little bit about the diversity of school meal programs, how school food is managed and funded, we'll start to consider what influences the purchases child nutrition programs make. 2 important influencers are meal pattern and nutrition requirements, which determine the types of food that programs serve, and meal costs, namely to illustrate what a typical school meal costs versus what a school food authority recoups for that meal. Remembering again that school food authorities are nonprofit and not funded through the district's general fund. The meal pattern is prescribed by the federal government, and adherence is a requirement for school food authorities. The pattern dictates what is considered a reimbursable meal. It prescribes the number and types of components that must be served, the serving size, which varies by grade level, and the frequency the components must be served. It also sets thresholds on the maximum amount of saturated fats, sodium, and trans fat that can be served, as well as the minimum and maximum allowance of calories. A reimbursable meal for the school breakfast program must be comprised of 3 components: fruit, grains, and fluid milk. A reimbursable meal in the National School Lunch Program must be comprised of 5 components: fruit, vegetable, with subgroups defined within the vegetable category, fluid milk, meat and meat alternatives, and grains. The meal pattern varies by grade level. A food item can have more than 1 component, for example, a hamburger plus the roll, like you see in the photo, and additional a la carte items are allowed to be sold as well, as long as they are served as a part of a reimbursable meal. Offer versus serve prescribes how reimbursable meals are served. In the school breakfast program, schools must offer 4 food items from 3 required food components and the minimum required quantities. Students must select 3, and 1 must be a half a cup of fruit and/or vegetable. This program is optional at all grade levels. In the National School Lunch Program, schools must offer all 5 components and the minimum required quantities. Students must select 3 of the 5, and 1 must be a half a cup of fruit and/or vegetables. Offer versus serve is required in all high schools, but optional in middle and elementary. Another key influencer we have to consider is the cost of school meals. I'm going to throw a bunch of numbers at you, not expecting that you're going to take them all in. I'll provide some high-level takeaways on the next slide as to what all of these numbers mean. According to the School Nutrition and Meal Cost Study released in 2019, the average cost to produce a school lunch was $3.81. The average cost to produce a school breakfast was $2.72. The breakdown of that is 45% on food, 45% for labor, and the remaining 10% for all other costs like supplies, contract services, etc. That equals $1.71 spent on food for a school lunch and $1.22 spent on food for a school breakfast program. Here we see how much school food authorities are reimbursed per meal, but first, a few important disclaimers. The cost data presented in the blue circle below is based on 14-15 school year data, while the reimbursement data in the table is based on 21-22 school year data. The data in the table is also the highest level of reimbursement possible. Further, it doesn't include the paid contribution, which varies, but based on 16-17 school year data, was on average $1.55 per breakfast and $2.74 per lunch. What we mean by paid contribution are those meals paid for by students. This also doesn't account for the value of USDA foods, which again is about 12 to 15% of the lunch tray. What we see here is that the highest reimbursement a school could receive falls within the lunch category, and it's at the free rate, which is nearly $3.81. So that's the revenue that they're receiving in reimbursement. And if you remember, based on that very dated data from 14-15, also depicted in the blue circle, the average cost to produce a school lunch was $3.81. So at best, they're breaking even, but more realistically, it costs more to produce a school lunch than all other sources of reimbursement. What that really matters is that cents matter quite a bit in school food. Another key takeaway, as these slides can be a bit gloomy, is that food service directors have flexibility in how they spend their food dollars. So they may go over this budget for some items on a special meal and balance it out by using more USDA foods and/or less expensive foods and other meals. We know that these numbers are small, so school meal programs have to be creative with how they purchase foods. Yet many school meal programs are serving delicious meals full of local foods on this budget, and those numbers can add up significantly across the state.
Even within the different school meal programs, individual school food authorities and school districts are very different in size, scale, and capacity to prepare foods. Just like a farm, if you've seen one school meal program kitchen, you've seen one school meal program kitchen. The equipment, space, storage, and staffing vary greatly across school meal programs. Kitchens vary from well-equipped industrial kitchens that have capacity to scratch cook to what we call a heat and serve kitchen, where food prepared somewhere off-site is reheated for service. Some school meal programs do not have the equipment or staff capacity to process fresh, whole foods themselves. These programs may need minimally processed products like chopped or cleaned produce, or fully prepared products to use in their programs. Based on their size, scale, equipment, and infrastructure, school meal programs have different production models. The first model is on-site food preparation. With this model, meals are prepared on-site at the school in their kitchen. In the central kitchen model, one large central kitchen, often called a commissary or a satellite production kitchen, prepares food and delivers the prepared meals to satellite locations. Often large districts like Buffalo or Syracuse will have a central commissary where they prepare complete meals and then send them out to the buildings within the district that don't have full kitchens. In some smaller districts where staffing is a challenge, preparation of certain components of the meal, like the entree, might happen at one school that has a more robust staff and then be delivered to other buildings. With vended meal sponsors, a third-party meal supplier is contracted by the local school food authority to prepare and deliver meals. Now we're going to dive a bit deeper into how schools purchase food and, more specifically, how they procure local foods. Schools will often turn to CCE for support in identifying sources of local foods. School food authorities can source local foods in a variety of ways. They can purchase local foods directly from producers. Many distributors in New York offer local produce or value-added New York food products. Food service management companies can provide local food, although they typically purchase them through distributors. They can get local food through retailers like stores or farmers markets, processors, food hubs and aggregators, gardens, including school and community gardens, and USDA foods. While there aren't typically New York food products available through USDA foods, some other states are able to get local products this way. There are many ways that schools incorporate local products. They can incorporate local foods in all meals, including breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They can even be incorporated as condiments, entree ingredients, herbs or spices, or salad bars. Harvest of the Month, New York Thursdays, and other local food celebrations are very popular in New York, and we'll talk more in depth about these later in the module. Snacks, including the Fresh Fruit and Vegetable Program, taste tests and educational activities, and special events like community meals or fundraisers. This is an example of what the timing of a school food authority's planning and procurement might look like. This varies quite a bit from one district to the next, but your big takeaway is that planning should start early. Some districts establish menus for the entire school year all at one time. Others do it 6 months at a time, and others do it just a month in advance. Getting to know how a district plans and helping them understand producers' growing and planning schedules is essential. Now we're going to talk about school food procurement. Procurement is the purchasing of goods and services. In order to support a district in using more local foods in their meal programs, it is essential to understand the procurement process. Here you see the steps that go into proper procurement. In reality, it's much more complicated than this, and you'll find variance from one district to the next. Procurement standards and regulatory requirements are guidelines that school food authorities must follow to remain in compliance with federal procurement regulations. Because school food authorities are using taxpayer dollars, there are controls put in place to make sure those dollars are used efficiently and effectively. The first is the Buy American provision. Schools are required to buy American-grown and processed food whenever possible. The next is free and open competition. Procurement must support full and open competition, ensuring all competitors are on a level playing field. Schools cannot specify local, but can target it in other ways we'll discuss momentarily. The next is responsive and responsible. Responsive means a vendor or producer must respond to requests in a way that meets all elements of that request. Responsible means a vendor or producer must be able to meet all the elements of the request. Tribal, state, or local entities might have specific regulations that influence procurement. The regulations may be more restrictive than federal procurement standards, as is the case in New York. The more restrictive regulation must be met. The federal government encourages program operators to take steps to contract with small, minority, and women-owned businesses when possible. This includes dividing solicitation requirements when economically feasible to ensure maximum participation. The United States Department of Agriculture Food and Nutrition Service does not mandate food safety requirements. Requirements around food safety differ from state to state and district to district. This information is often included in the vendor requirements section of a solicitation, but can present as a specification as well. In CCE, we often get asked about GAP certification, and some growers and schools even assume it's just required. There's no state or federal requirement that schools can only procure GAP certified produce. However, an individual SFA can require this, though it's not typically the case. The geographic preference option allows school food authorities to use a geographic preference for the procurement of unprocessed agricultural products, both locally grown and locally raised. It grants authority to school food authorities to define local. In other words, an SFA gets to decide what local means to them. This might be produced within a certain number of miles of the district, within the region, within the state, etc. It only applies to unprocessed agricultural products. It doesn't apply to, for example, cooked beef patties, chocolate milk, or yogurt. It clarifies that a preference is a preference, not a specification. In other words, it doesn't prohibit a vendor who doesn't meet those specifications from responding to the bid. An SFA can't say on their bid local potatoes or New York potatoes, but can give more points to a vendor who is, for example, located within a certain number of miles of the district. SFAs can also target local products by, for example, giving preference to producers who can visit the school or vendors that can deliver within 24 hours of harvest. This preference may be given by adding points or adjusting submitted bid prices of local producers in a bid comparison, meaning even if a producer's actual proposed price is higher than other bidders, that producer's adjusted points or pricing based on geographic preference may make them the best price in comparison, allowing them to win a contract. When school food authorities use geographic preference, it doesn't change how much you as a producer would be paid for a product, but changes the bid price just for comparison. Here's some sample language that could be included. School food authorities utilize a variety of procurement methods. The type of method applied is generally dependent on the dollar value of the purchase. This differs in some cases. For example, some districts don't allow micro purchases or small purchases and instead require formal purchases, though this is rare. The micro purchase threshold is $10,000. This is a non-competitive purchase, meaning a solicitation isn't required, but it still can't limit competition. Purchases must be equitably distributed across qualified suppliers. So for example, you shouldn't abuse the micro purchase in order to buy all your apples from a single supplier for the entire school year, even if your total purchase would fall under $10,000. A micro purchase could be a one-time order, or it could be a few small orders. Informal procurement is very commonly used in New York to purchase produce because we have a lot of small and mid-sized districts. The small purchase threshold in New York State is $20,000 for non-local foods and $50,000 for New York State food and milk purchases. Informal procurement requires an SFA to provide product specifications. This might be over the phone or an email request for a price quote or a more formal request for quotes. Informal or small procurement is often referred to as 3 bids and a buy. In reality, most SFAs get weekly produce quote sheets emailed to them from 3 area distributors, and they choose to get all or a majority of their produce from one of them. Formal procurement is for anything over $20,000 for non-local products or over $50,000 for local products. Formal procurement looks like an invitation for bid to award a fixed price contract or a request for proposals to award either a fixed price or cost reimbursable contract. Though procurement methods can vary greatly in application, the procurement process remains largely the same regardless of the size and scale of the purchase, with some slight variations. This is the process that school food authorities go through to procure local foods. First, they develop the solicitation, including specifications that describe in detail the product needed, the estimated volume, frequency, and packaging needs, the timeline for purchase and delivery, and terms and conditions, etc. Next, they advertise. Then they evaluate responses to determine the lowest responsive and responsible bidder and award the contract. And finally, they manage the contract, which includes monitoring contractor performance for compliance. This concludes our presentation. If you're interested in taking a deeper dive, please feel free to explore the included resources or reach out to myself or Cheryl.